All right. Shall we get started here? We're at our 6:33 time. Give people some time to show up. Looks like we've got a good list of attendees here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. Looks like the recording has started, so the event has officially started here. I'm Carl Hansen here with my co-chair Abby Arnold of Santa Monica Forward, and we're thrilled to host this panel tonight that is on, I think, an incredibly important topic. A huge thank you to Councilmember Gleam Davis for bringing this forward in Santa Monica, and to the council members that supported this as this came through as part of the housing element discussions that the city has been having. We're excited to have some of the city leaders from other cities that have explored this topic and led the way on this, and they'll be introduced here shortly. But I wanted to start off just at the high level of why this is important for Santa Monica Forward. Forward was founded to help build a more diverse and equitable and sustainable Santa Monica. This is an issue that I think converges with all of those goals. Particularly with the need for more affordable housing and how that can be done in a way that addresses historic racist zoning policy that Santa Monica, like many other cities, has had in place. It's my privilege to introduce our moderator now tonight, Amy Anderson, who I'm sure many of you know. Amy has spent her career in affordable housing development. She recently served as the Chief Housing Officer for LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, and currently serves as Senior Vice President with Wells Fargo's foundation, where she's working to make national philanthropic investments in strategies that help expand the supply of affordable housing. And as many of you know, she served as a housing commissioner here a planning commissioner here in Santa Monica for many years, and was a tremendous loss not to have her there now. But we really appreciated her service and are thrilled that she's taken the time out tonight to moderate this exciting panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy. Amy, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, thanks so much, Carl. Really, it's an honor to be able to join this conversation this evening as moderator. I really appreciate Santa Monica Forward's leadership around discussing housing issues and helping us to think about strategies for responding to our community's affordability crisis. So joining us, as Carl pointed out, tonight will be two out-of-towners, David Luberoff, who's the Deputy Director at the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, and Berkeley Councilmember Terry Taplin. And we'll also have a couple of local elected officials. I believe Gleam Davis from Santa Monica will be joining us, as well as John Erickson from the city of West Hollywood. So our program this evening will start with a presentation from David, who will provide us with background about Cambridge's affordable housing overlay, as well as some information about the process that it took to get the overlay adopted. We'll talk to Terry about Berkeley's decision to also pursue the overlay tool, and then we'll explore with our local elected officials their preliminary thoughts about a housing overlay. A couple of housekeeping things. We're really interested in your questions. The Q&A is available, or hopefully should be available for you. So pop your questions into the Q&A. We're crossing our fingers that we can get to a lot of the questions tonight. We'll do our best in the time that we have available. I'm going to introduce David in just a second, but I just wanted to take a second again to emphasize Really, what an opportune moment this is for us to be having this conversation about this new and innovative tool. As I'm sure everyone participating knows, Southern California cities are in the midst of creating their housing element updates. And the demand for housing and particularly affordable housing production is significant. 1.3 million housing units in the SCAG region overall, including over 500,000 units that are affordable to low-income households. And in our Santa Monica city alone, our regional housing needs assessment goal is to produce nearly 9,000 units, about half of which should be affordable to low-income households. So it's a really significant obligation that will require adoption of some thoughtful and effective policies to get us there. So to tell us more about some thoughtful and effective policy, David Luberoff. David is a lecturer at Harvard. He is a researcher and an author on infrastructure and land use policies and the politics behind them. And most relevant to our discussion tonight, he really closely followed the adoption of Cambridge's, and this is Cambridge, Massachusetts, Affordable Housing Overlay Ordinance. So I'm going to turn it over to David to really educate us about this, this special tool.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite to come out and speak. One of the things I do at the Joint Center is oversee our events, and when we sat down, let me share my screen. Okay, are we seeing the right screen now?
Good.
One of the things that we do is try and think about what are interesting things that we can highlight in our public events series. And as we looked out across the country in late 2020 and early 2021, we were very struck that Cambridge and perhaps Portland, Oregon really had done the most interesting things in the last year. We had been following the affordable housing overlay discussions in Cambridge for several years, but they had finally resulted in passage of a pretty interesting and I think significant piece of zoning in October of 2020. And so we put together an event. A lot of the slides that I'll be showing you were developed in the course of that event, particularly by Cambridge's Community Development Department. So let me, I couldn't resist being a Cantabrigian, the two people's republics, and what is it about that Cambridge is doing that might actually be of interest to Santa Monica and some of the other nearby cities. And as you can see, Randy Shaw, who's one of the more, I think, interesting and provocative writers on affordable housing issues, essentially has said what Cambridge has done in his estimation is a model for other localities. Hang on a second, I'm having just a little bit of, there we go. So that's what we're going to talk about. I sort of start, so I'm going to do 5 things, hopefully in a reasonable amount of time. What's the problem? What did Cambridge do? How did they do it? How is it actually being used? It's now been in place for several months. And then I think where we want to end, what lessons might this offer? So let's start with the problem. I always start by just sort of saying, well, what do the demographics look like? And what was striking to me, I did, sort of the usual things that I would do, is in many respects, Cambridge and Santa Monica look relatively similar, roughly the same population, both relatively affluent, majority white, non-Hispanic, but not overwhelmingly, and significant shares in both communities of renters. You can read the rest of the chart. Both have a modest African-American population, which, at least at the median, is really in a very different economic situation. Somewhat true also for Hispanics or Latinos. We also at the Joint Center look a lot at cost burdens down in the bottom right. Cost burdens anybody who's spending more than 30% of their income on rent, and those are actually slightly lower than national averages. It's about 50% nationally, but still quite high. And in both communities, slightly over 20% of folks are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. And as Matt Desmond, the author of Evicted, has famously said, the rent eats first. So people who are spending more than 50% of their income are often cutting back on other key needs. So we rightfully should be worried about this. Cambridge, to put this in context, has long supported affordable housing and has been, over the last couple of years, increasing a lot of those efforts before we even get to the Affordable Housing Overlay District. Has a very robust inclusionary housing program. I won't go through the details here. I'll make these slides available if anybody wants them later. Has actually just increased the assessment for essentially the inclusionary zoning for commercial development. And the city, from its own funds, has provided substantial support for affordable housing. Massachusetts has something called the Community Preservation Act, which is a surcharge on your property taxes with a modest state, not really a match anymore, but supplement. Cambridge has really gone all in for this on affordable housing. Most communities are using it to buy up open space. That should not say 1.6, it should be 166 million between FY 2002 and FY 2020. Cambridge has done a lot, but it hasn't done $1.7 billion. And in the last several years has been putting some money, other city money in as it's been able. And that money over, essentially almost 2 decades has preserved about 1,000 units. There was a lot of expiring use units. It's acquired and created more than 600 rental units and some first-time homebuyer units. So this is a city that's been active, but there are some problems. The first that turns out to be really significant is that the affordable, and I put affordable in quotes here as in the publicly subsidized housing, is almost entirely in the eastern half of the city and to a certain extent in the northern part of the city. Those of you who know Cambridge know that the part near Fresh Pond down here, this is the sort of the so-called Brattle Street district, large single family houses, arguably some mansions. This is North Cambridge, where Tip O'Neill was from, more historically working class neighborhood. And this was Kendall Square, once an industrial area, now a biotech area. But you can sort of see the historic vestiges here. If I showed you the historic redlining maps, they would look really familiar. If I showed you some of the historic maps of where the Black neighborhoods, at least historically, have been in Cambridge. So there was this sense that the city's neighborhoods were not kind of equally sharing in the responsibility. The other kind of obvious thing is that Cambridge zoning, like zoning in most places, really made it hard to build multifamily affordable housing. What I want you to pay attention to here are all of the parts of the map that are in yellow. The lightest yellow, which again was that affluent district right about here, is zoned for single family housing. There's 2 different zoning districts, so lots of it you can read. Large lots, no higher than 35 feet, a lot of open space. The darker yellow, which is really the bulk of the city, is by zoning limited to single, 2-family and townhouses, in some cases very modest residential. Not a huge size lot, but still sizable, still with height limits, and still with open space limits. So the places where you could build in Cambridge, for the most part, have been greatly limited. And just if that wasn't complicated enough, and I'm assuming everyone here knows their housing, that the process was unpredictable. This is an affordable housing development. In Massachusetts, we have a law called 40B, which allows for a comprehensive permit process. It also allows the state to override local zoning when a community lacks enough affordable housing. Cambridge actually is over that limit, but still uses the comprehensive permit process. As you can see here, that leads to a delay, which leads to a forced redesign, which ultimately results in smaller units. I think the combination of this is between the underlying zoning, the unpredictability of the process, and the kind of empowerment of communities, was a growing recognition that those both nonprofit and private developers of affordable housing could not compete for developable land. That was sort of the growing recognition. Starting in about 2015, 2016, Cambridge went through about a 3-year citywide sort of planning process, resulted in the publication of Envision Cambridge. And 3 really, I think, important ideas emerged. And these are really, in the end, the heart of the affordable housing, the 100% affordable housing overlay district. Allow for sort of greater density, relaxed dimensional standards, reduce parking requirements. So basically you can build bigger. Streamline the permitting process, because it's the uncertainty, particularly for the nonprofits, that really kills them financially. And essentially apply this citywide so that it'll apply to all parts of the city, would have some responsibility for housing. The idea here, and I'm going to come back to this a couple times, is to make it possible for those who want to do 100% affordable housing projects to essentially compete in the marketplace with those folks who want to do private development, even if it's speculative based on some sort of zoning variance. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting and challenging aspects of this. And then the other is to do this in a way that doesn't completely overwhelm existing neighborhoods. And I'll show you how that was done. This was proposed officially in 2018, was the subject of intense discussion and debate, which we'll get into. In 2019, it was tabled, essentially a parliamentary procedure, so that it could be brought back because it didn't have enough votes. 2019 November was an election in the city of Cambridge, where this was a major issue. And in October, as I mentioned, in October 2020, it passed. So what exactly did Cambridge do? I won't read this to you, and you can skim through it. A Better Cambridge is a group I'll talk about, was a YIMBY group formed by some relatively younger residents of Cambridge, who were increasingly frustrated that this was not a city where they could felt like they could afford to live or afford to stay, and were really important backers of this. This was their blog just before Cambridge passed, saying, who would have thunk that we were going to be able to do this. So the first thing that the overlay zoning does is it increases the height limits for projects that are 100% affordable. And I'll come back to what we mean when we say 100% affordable. If they're 100% affordable, then single family, 2-family, townhouse, or multifamily are allowed of right anywhere in Cambridge. And you can see on the right side of this screen what the minimum height is typically, or maximum height, excuse me, under the underlying zoning, and essentially what the bonus gives. And it's giving you essentially 1 to 2 more floors, is really the way to think about it. The ranges in height have to do with whether or not there's an active non-residential use on the ground floor. Just to give you a feel for what that looks like. So as you saw in most of the city, the height limit, the underlying zoning is 40 feet or less. With the overlay zoning, you can go up to 45 feet. You essentially get another story. The left side shows you a schematic that the Cambridge Community Development Department came to sort of show you what that might look like. And then the right side essentially is to say, this is what exists in a place like Cambridge. There are buildings that aren't substantially bigger, but are bigger. And this is roughly the scale. This is the same thing for districts with slightly taller buildings, again, to give you a feel for that. The ordinance also has some very, very detailed design requirements. I'm not going to go into those in depth. I do have some backup slides somebody really wants to see that. But they have to do with transition buffers where you're going between a residential, a lower density residential neighborhood. Some required setbacks in open space, although less than what the underlying zoning calls for. Some interesting requirements related to facades in larger buildings so that they'd have to be broken up, much as you can sort of see here in the picture. There's some other design related requirements. No required off-street parking, which is pretty interesting. And anyone who's done housing in any neighborhood knows is quite controversial. And interestingly, almost always required bicycle parking. The exception is sometimes in buildings that are being reused, where it's really hard to figure out how to get that in. And I believe also for buildings that are quite close to bike share stations, don't have to have as much bicycle parking. Coming back to this question about who is the affordable housing for. So at least for the rental units, at least 80% of the units affordable to households at 80% of AMI, the rest up to 100%. For the home ownership units, at least 50% to 80% AMI, the rest to 100% AMI. You can see what that works out to, at least in Cambridge, for 2- and 4-person households. And all of the units are permanently affordable by covenant. So the home ownership units are set up in such a way that the homeowners will be able to make some return on their investment, but when the units are sold, they will still continue to be affordable. I actually don't have the details on how Cambridge is doing that, but conceptually we know how to do that. The community land trust model has provided that. This isn't actually a public review hearing for land use in Cambridge, although they probably feel like that. In fact, I know they feel like that, and I have a hunch they feel like that in California at times. This is the other really key change. So there's many required steps, but there is no appeal. There's a series, as you can see, a series of meetings. The planning board comments, but the planning board in the end makes a final non-binding report. There is a sort of interesting backdoor, which is that the Affordable Housing Trust in Cambridge is typically going to be providing funding to make these projects work. I'll talk about this more in a second, which means that if the planning board really hated a project and it was still going forward, it's quite likely that the Affordable Housing Trust, which is at least staffed by the city, would probably refuse to provide the funding. So it's, for the most part, not the kind of design review as we know it, where people are kind of wind up in sort of endless processes, but there is a process here. What does it look like the net effect might be? We had a graduate student with a background in real estate work with us to try and do essentially some back of the envelope calculations. It looks like if you do everything I just said, or that Cambridge is doing, you'll reduce development costs by about 10 to 15% per leasable, saleable square foot. Those of you who do housing will, of course, immediately say you can't make it work without subsidies. And I think that that's true. Not I think that's true. That's absolutely true. Folks in Cambridge will tell you that. It's probably the one misconception about what Cambridge has done. This has not made it possible to build without other public subsidies, 100% affordable housing. You will require continued public support. This is where the Cambridge's Affordable Housing Trust, the varying state programs, LIHTC, whatever else may or may not be coming out of Washington. Nevertheless, I go back to the point I was making before, which is that it looks like when you pencil this out, this should make it possible for a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer wanting to play in this market to make a competitive bid for a parcel or property, and that seems to be the case. I'm going to step back for a second and sort of say, this is pretty extraordinary, particularly it seems to me in a place like Cambridge, eliminating that or substantially reducing the design review process was a huge step and was bitterly fought. And again, I think the the Better Cambridge folks kind of really nailed it. Fights over housing development are a constant feature of Cambridge politics. To add to the level of difficulty, at the time this was up for a vote, Massachusetts required a 2/3 vote of the governing body to pass any zoning change. So Cambridge has 9 city councilors. That meant that you had to get 6 to agree. I started my career as a reporter in Cambridge covering the city council. It was hard to get 6 city councilors to agree that, tonight is Tuesday, much less a change in the zoning. So this is a really hard thing, and was just an enormous undertaking. When you include the regular city council meetings, this is City Councilor Mark McGovern, who really led the charge in Cambridge. Mark counted over 40 public hearings over the course from 2017, when the Envision Cambridge Housing Working Group came up with this concept, to it going to the council, et cetera. And there was a very active opposition on essentially all of the issues that you would expect to come up. And these are real issues. People care about their neighborhoods. Again, I won't read the list. The illustration on the left is from a group that came together called the Cambridge Citizens Coalition. I think a lot of people argue, and I believe correctly, that they tended to overstate the case. I know that never happens in the public discourse on the West Coast, but it surely happens where we are. So this was sort of the battle. As I said, it was tabled in 2019 after the 2019 city council elections, where A Better Cambridge really led the charge of making this a key issue. It wound up passing in October. As I look at it, I would say there are 4 kind of critical factors that made this possible. The first was it had internal champions. In my experience, there's got to be 1 or 2 elected officials who really decide to take this on. As I said, in Cambridge, it was Mark McGovern. There were other councilors who were with him all along, although it wasn't their particular issue that they were working. And then Mark and the advocates kind of persistently working on the other councilors. The other was, over time, having the support from the professional staff to provide the kind of analyses and guidance about how varying aspects would work. So kind of an internal game. The second is this outside game. There was really a new set of actors, A Better Cambridge, which emerged initially as a YIMBY group supporting projects with inclusionary zoning. A new set of actors, very public, very dynamic. I think it was really exciting to see just a whole new set of leaders emerge. And as I said, very actively involved in the 2019 election. The third is just timing. Housing issues have been around in Santa Monica and Cambridge forever, but I think growing recognition over the last, particularly 5 to 10 years, really as we've come out of the Great Recession, the share of renters who are cost burdened has not really come down. It's come down a few percentage points, but it's really been stubbornly high at about 50% nationally. And then really, starting, or really over the summer of 2020, but building, I think, over the last couple of years, the reemergence of racial justice concerns and issues, and the linkage of those to kind of historic zoning practices, excuse me. And then finally, and quite striking in Cambridge, was what I call the inside game. The city councilors were, in addition to consulting with the community development department, excuse me, we're kind of consulting with what I think of as kind of the old guard of housing experts to assess proposed amendments, what could work. What Mark McGovern told me was when somebody would propose an amendment, he would call up this group, which included a couple of the city's longtime terrific nonprofit developers, and say, could you live with this? So as you can see, there were 62 separate amendments proposed. 46 of them were adopted. That's why the design guidelines are so extensive. The city of Somerville, which is next to Cambridge, which is recently passed its own version of this, did it much quicker and with many fewer amendments. But I think in Cambridge, it just required this kind of consultation. Okay, so this is in place. Randy Shaw and other people said this is a great idea. This is from the Cambridge Community Development website. But is anybody actually doing this, or do they want to? We haven't banned the old way of doing this. As of today, there are 3 projects using the affordable housing overlay process. Just to start, a Cambridge-based nonprofit actually is using it on a development, a site they had bought before this passed, which is about 100+ units up in North Cambridge. The Cambridge Housing Authority is using it to finish the modernization of an existing development, presumably as part of the RAD process. And more recently, Wynn Companies, which is the affordable housing arm of Wynn Development, a major Boston-based development firm, is using it in a proposal to add 100 new affordable units on the massive parking lot of an existing 240 unit affordable development. What I have not seen yet is a project where either the for-profit or nonprofit developer was able to get the land. In all these cases, the developers already had the land. When we did our event on this in March, the folks from Just to Start were in the process of negotiations, I think on 2 sites, and they knew they were competitive, but that hasn't emerged yet. And I think that's going to be a challenge having to do with the calibration. So let me finish up with sort of 5 kind of closing thoughts on kind of what I take away from this. The first was this very careful analysis that said, how much more zoning, what kind of zoning bonus would we have to provide to make a parcel competitive for a nonprofit developer, but not so lucrative that essentially the landowner would be capturing the extra value. This very similar analysis, by the way, went on in Portland, which building on the state law requiring duplexes and fourplexes in all of the state cities, has a somewhat similar proposal allowing, I think it's up to 6 plexes on parcels where those are 100% affordable. So this really requires good analysis, because otherwise you're just going to wind up giving a windfall to some property owners. And in fact, after Cambridge passed this ordinance, the nonprofit developers say that, you know, a lot of the property owners were calling them up, kind of, you know, licking their chops, saying, hey, this is great. The second is, don't underestimate the power of predictability. I was really struck as I kind of have dug into this at how important it was for the nonprofit developers to know if they basically followed the rules, that they would get the approvals they need, and they could estimate that time. And that just it was huge. They said that in some cases maybe even more important than the zoning bonuses. The third is, I think if you look here, I think if you look at Oregon's passage of the duplex plus law a couple of years ago, is there are intriguing opportunities to expand and strengthen the coalition of supporters. I think in the case of Cambridge, it was really bringing the racial justice issue to the fore in terms of the argument as to why neighborhoods that had not had affordable housing might really have the responsibility to do so, even if it was a little bit denser than neighbors wanted, and even if the arguments about density were really stalking horses for other arguments. This has been fascinating in Cambridge, because a lot of the folks who are not happy about this do think of themselves as you know, great liberals, and in many cases are at least in other domains, just not necessarily in their backyard. The fourth, I was really struck when we did our event, when I talked with Mark, actually in the event and earlier, Mark McGovern, a longtime Cambridge City Councilor who has served as mayor, said, I was ready to lose my seat on this. There was a lot of opposition, and I knew that I might not be reelected. And this was just too important. And he was ready to lose on principle. And I really respect that. And I think those, particularly the electeds who are listening to this, if you're going to take this one on, know that this could be the thing that causes you to not have to go to all those community meetings. And then finally, organize. That this really came about, as I said earlier, the concerted, often coordinated efforts between elected officials, appointed officials, often working quietly behind the scenes, longtime activists and new actors. And I want to leave you, this is the end of that same blog from the Cambridge, the Better Cambridge. And in this case, I actually do want to read it because I think it's very powerful. Activism can be a slog. Instant gratification almost never happens. Advocates need to plow ahead in the face of countless obstacles that are relentlessly thrown in their way. In the world of housing activism, opponents of new housing never rest. They like their neighborhoods the way they are and often have lots of times on their hands. They usually win, but not this time. I hope that that's also the case if this looks appealing in Santa Monica and Berkeley and other communities, that you also win on this battle. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'm happy to chat with folks after the event via email, or if it'd be helpful to jump on a call, I'm happy to do that. And thank you again for the opportunity.
David, if you would just not go away for a second, and maybe I'll just toss out a couple of immediate questions to you. So thanks for this
Sure.
presentation.
Do you want me to leave my screen share up, or are we?
I don't think you need the screen share.
Okay, yeah, just I didn't know if we were like, hey, I didn't understand slide 6. Can we go back and look at that?
No, really, really great presentation, and it's so helpful to have you cover the background and the technical aspects and the community engagement aspects, because right, all of those pieces are critical to putting new housing policies in place. So one question I had for you, you emphasized this a couple of times, but I wanted to just ask you to parse it out a little bit more, is how the affordable housing overlay was helpful to affordable housing developers in competing successfully to acquire land. And if I think that there's a lot of folks on the call who understand housing, but maybe not everyone. So can you just
I'm not, not being an actual affordable housing developer, I'm not sure I can parse this out, but essentially, if you're figuring out, if I can put X number of units, I know what I can get in tax credits. I know roughly how much money the city's willing to give me per unit, essentially as gap financing. The fact that I can, if I can add a floor and, 2 or 3 more units to the building, right? So if instead of being at 3 stories, I'm at 4 stories, so I've got another floor, and however many units, depending on the size of the parcel, it makes the bottom line work that much better. It was interesting in Cambridge, that was all done essentially as a quiet negotiation. So that literally was, I think, I was never able to find the public document that essentially walked people through that. In Portland, Oregon, the affordable housing advocates actually started with that analysis, and essentially, so if you look up the Portland work, which is a different, it's not exactly the same thing, but conceptually it's the same thing. They actually walk you through the math of why if now under the new state zoning, you could do a fourplex on a site in Portland. If it's all affordable units, I believe it's 6 units, and why those numbers then work.
That's great, thank you. And one more question, and then we'll turn to our other out-of-town guest, Terry Taplin. Did the advocates or did the city ever make any kind of projection in terms of what the, either number of sites that, additional sites that might be able to be gained from this tool, or additional units? Because I think that can kind of cut both ways, right? It's like, this is an important tool, so we get this many more, or just to allay concerns and say, like, it's not going to result in every other property, becoming a multi-story.
It's really interesting. I haven't seen a good analysis of that. I think at one level, it's relatively modest. At another, I just showed you, there's 300 units, more than 300 units in the pipeline right now using this process. Now, some of those might have been in the process anyway, but they'll get through quicker. It's a little bit hard. There's this wonderful irony, and I was thinking about it. I was looking at some clips earlier today. The opponents, on the one hand, were arguing this is going to destroy our neighborhoods. And then right before the last city council vote, one of the 2 councilors who voted no said, we're creating all of this chaos, and we're actually only going to produce, a handful of units. And I remember Mark McGovern saying to me, well, which is it? Am I destroying the city, or am I doing something that's not? I can't be doing both at the same time. My hunch is it's going to be modest. I mean, Cambridge is not a big city. It's 3+ square miles, and much of it is already developed. And I think particularly in the existing neighborhoods, the parcels are going to be relatively small. The opportunities are probably greatest in some of those parts of the city where there's still some industrial land that hasn't already been bought up for development. I mean, any of you who know Cambridge, Kendall Square was for a long time kind of an old industrial wasteland, and it's just completely transformed. And that's true of most of the other industrial areas, but there are still sites a la the Justice Start one. So my guess is, we know we need thousands of units, and this will be one of the tools that at least gets you hundreds of units.
Yeah, you need that. You need the whole quiver.
Yep.
All right, well, thanks, David. Don't go away. We'll have more questions for you later on. So next, I want to introduce Terry Taplin, who's agreed to join us from Berkeley. Terry was elected to the Berkeley City Council in November of 2020. I think beautifully, he grew up in Berkeley and has really personally and directly struggled with the kind of scenarios that we talk about here in Santa Monica, which is, how do you help the next generation to stay in the community or to return to the community. And during his campaign, and certainly now that he's on council, he's been a vocal and tireless advocate for stronger housing policies, supporting the adoption of a resolution to allow fourplexes in single family neighborhoods, and proposing a social housing pilot. And of course, most relevant to our discussion tonight, being part of the group of city council members in Berkeley that directed their staff to prepare a affordable housing overlay that's modeled on Cambridge's. So Terry, love to have you join and really share your thoughts on what motivated you to introduce this idea in Berkeley.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Well, when Cambridge's overlay was passed, I was a few weeks out from my own election. And so I was like, okay, well, if I win, Berkeley has to pursue this. I follow Randy Shaw pretty closely, and in the moment he was like, oh, we should do this, I was like, you're right. And so around January, my office and I were looking at our work plan for the year, and triangulating all of our housing proposals, and the overlay was included, submitted rather, around the same time as the resolution to end exclusionary zoning, the planning commission referral to consider fourplexes as part of our housing element. The goal was to really present a comprehensive housing policy vision to address the multiple concerns that our community has around housing affordability, anti-displacement, infill and climate justice, etc. A funny thing that happened was that there was so much opposition and hellfire and doom around the fourplex that the social housing pilot program, the affordable housing overlay, got delayed and are now actually suspended in committee until the fall based on a recent rules change. But in any case, we really wanted to ensure that we were not just raising the alarm about Berkeley's inability to meet our RHNA obligations for low and moderate income households, but we're actually removing the barriers to the construction of affordable housing. And so the Cambridge overlay was really a godsend for us over here, because we have so many people who say things like, okay, well, it has to be 100% affordable or nothing, or if it's 100% affordable, it can be as tall as the moon, or as high as the moon, or whatever, and so in introducing the overlay, one of our goals was to really make it impossible to say no, because whether you're, we, or rather, I saw some strange opposition, some sort of strange bedfellows of NIMBYism, if you will, because you had folks who were otherwise very pro-housing who are opposed to the idea that we would allow for, all BMR housing. You had folks who were so vocal about affordability during the fourplex conversation, who refused to let go of discretionary review, and who just actually don't like apartments. And this kind of forces everyone to really articulate their values and stand by them. But we're in the very beginning stages. Our draft referral is still in committee. Hopefully it passes, and it will then go to the planning commission for the consideration of design reviews, objective design standards, etc. The conversation around ministerial approval and the design standards I've found to be the most intriguing. Berkeley, we're a city where beauty and intellect are really interwoven to our civic identity. But you have homes in the old industrial area selling for $1.5 million and up. And we've seen such a bleeding of our African American population since the 70s, and all these things that we cling to. People are having to take a step back and see how those have brought us to this place, and it's been uncomfortable for some folks. We, during the conversations around ending exclusionary zoning, people became very upset to realize that their neighborhoods were designed to keep out people like me. No one wants to think that they're racist. No one wants to think that they're classist. And nor were any of us, myself, my colleagues, and our network of advocates saying that. We were just illustrating the legacy of redlining, exclusionary zoning, as part of our overall conversation around racial justice. And I didn't anticipate how painful that would be for folks, even though I grew up here. But one thing that, and it's, I've had to read some emails that were, I never thought people would say such things to me before. But, I always have to think about why I'm doing this. A few years ago, my partner and I were living together in Southside Telegraph. This is an area south of UC Berkeley. We were living in a rent-controlled apartment, and we lost that apartment, and we had, an older, wealthier friend say, like, "Oh, well, why don't you guys just find another apartment?" And this is someone who splits the year between a condo in Richmond and a horse ranch in Germany. Just saying, "Oh, just go find an apartment." And we looked and we couldn't find one. And being displaced from Berkeley, dealing with temporary homelessness, returning to Berkeley, having to separate from my partner because of our grad school and care for my mom. My mom is an elder and stuff. And we, to this day, we still live separately. But that's pretty much why I ran, because I was like, okay, like, in my life, the worst has happened. I have to, start fighting so that others don't have to experience this. So I'm willing to be screamed at and yelled at. I'm willing to, to entertain everyone's aesthetic architectural proclivities. If it means people like me can continue growing up here. And so, yeah, I bet the story of Cambridge's victory to me is like the Iliad. Sorry to be such a geek, but I study ancient Greek and Latin in undergrad, and I have to put the bachelor's to use somehow. So I think it's really inspiring, and I'm happy to see that Santa Monica is pursuing it. I think the more of us here on the West Coast that really pursue this, the better. It's so easy to just say that all housing should be 100% affordable. It's another thing entirely to ensure that the structural barriers are removed.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for sharing your own experience, and just for highlighting, how I think, you started to kind of outline a little bit of what Cambridge experiences, which is like, this is a tough conversation for folks, right? And it really does lift up what is more important, or most important to them, and expose values. I think, I guess one of the things I'm curious about for Berkeley is a little bit about the organizing that might be going on, or coalition building. Is there a group or a group of groups that are engaged in that? How is that playing out up in Berkeley?
We definitely have a group of groups. Like Cambridge, we have a cohort of younger, newer folks who were mobbing around the different meetings. We have Berkeley Neighbors for Housing Action and Climate. Berkeley Neighbors for Housing and Climate Action. We have South Berkeley now, North Berkeley now, Walk Bike Berkeley, and we also have East Bay for Everyone. And we have some really strong alliances with our Democratic clubs, Cal Dems and East Bay Young Democrats. And over the past several years, we've been able to gain a number of seats on council. Most recently, my seat, I sort of emerged out of nowhere and was able to build a coalition around myself that kind of carried me to council, and that I'm still in close communication and coalition with. But that's been a really critical part of us changing the culture of not just housing discourse, but civic engagement in Berkeley. Especially now that the meetings are on Zoom, it's more accessible. We have more than 7 people who come to every meeting and speak for infinite amounts of time. We're able to hold more nuanced space, more nuanced discussions. And without that, I think we would still be losing lawsuits for trying to block housing.
It's great. It's great to have so many more people engaged. I want to maybe throw a question out to both you and David, which I think you know, for a lot of community members is probably the component of the program that might be of most concern, right? I guess I'm curious about how Cambridge or how you anticipate Berkeley is going to specifically tackle this idea of multifamily development in single family neighborhoods. I'm guessing that, you know, here in Santa Monica and other West Side cities, that it's that policy in particular that, you know, I think is of concern or fear, or however you want to couch it. And I guess I'm curious about whether there were you know, specific, you know, strategies or approaches you use to address those that component specifically.
I mean, you know, it's interesting because you know, that's what the nut that Cambridge finally cracked, which is it's not math. I think partly it's thinking about scale. So the multifamily in, you know, if you think about the neighborhoods that are mainly single family houses, it's the buildings can still only be what, 45 feet tall. So it's not going to be a huge number of units. And if you think about the just the size of the parcels. And then I think a lot of it was, as I said, I think reframing some of this, and Terry, I was really struck by, you know, what you were talking about, you know, really calling people out, saying, you know, this is exclusionary. It's a history of exclusion, which is historically had a racial component. And I think it just became at least in Cambridge and Berkeley and Santa Monica, a harder position to sort of hold. But that's, you know, Amy, I think you're right that you know, that's the tough nut to crack. But that's also the nut, if you think about that Minneapolis cracked and Oregon cracked, of saying, because of equity concerns, because of affordability concerns, that, you know, we just have to deal with this. The other thing, truthfully, I think also in Cambridge is, it's kind of hard to argue against multifamily housing in Cambridge, because even in the most affluent neighborhoods in Cambridge, if you walk 2 blocks, for the most part, you'll be someplace that's got multifamily housing, right? That you know, the neighborhoods change so fast that sort of claiming that it'll be the death of Western civilization as we know it, such as it is, just is I think you just have to call people out on the absurdity.
I mean, I'll just add that, you know, in Berkeley, I mean, the big lift for us was the resolution for ending single family zoning and the fourplex referral to the planning commission. I mean, that was like, I mean, that was, you know, that was our battle of Agincourt, if you will. And there's still some, you know, hurt feelings about it, and people are still like kind of mad about it. But, you know, a lot of folks, like most like resident voters, like, you know, aren't as deeply engaged as people who are heavily in favor or heavily opposed to a particular legislation. And in our office, we've tried to really engage folks who have questions and concerns. I think it's been so easy in Berkeley to just sort of like dig in our heels and draw our lines in the sand and just fire back and forth. But if you, I mean, of course, there are people who are not interested in actual conversation, but most folks I found are and have been. And I think, you know, we have our remaining single family neighborhoods are in different parts of town. Like there's one in my district that was formerly kind of a center for African-American home ownership, and that's no longer the case. The others are in the hills and North Berkeley, which are certainly not predominantly African-American. And so it's really important to be able to engage the particular concerns of each neighborhood. You know, there is of course a lot of overlap at times, but folks on my side of town are really interested in things like intergenerational living. We have a lot of grandparents who have children return home with young children and folks are able to take care of their elders, like me with my mom, and being able to show how multifamily housing facilitates intergenerational living has been really successful for us. In the other parts of town, we have like a number of really big multiplexes that look like single family homes that people assume are single family homes. And being able to point out that, well, like David was saying, these are things that are already in our neighborhoods. They're not these, alien monsters that are going to destroy our lives. These are the neighbors we already have, and isn't this beautiful? And for the Elmwood, which is where single family zoning was pioneered for us in Berkeley, there are so many gorgeous duplexes and fourplexes, and appealing to people's pride around them has also been successful. But it's also important. It's like kind of have like a flaming sword and a lily with this stuff.
Terry, I was thinking that ADUs would be the other way that folks have been trying to crack that nut sometimes. And I haven't seen Cambridge really take that one on. I didn't know if Berkeley had taken that on, and often, either as an affordability issue or as a way for people to do kind of multi-gen. Is that something Berkeley's doing?
Yeah, people are head over heels over ADUs over here. So.
And just to clarify, David, the state of California, right, adopted legislation that made ADUs and junior ADUs by right in all single family zones. So in some ways, we don't have single family zoning in California anymore. Anyway. Yep. Terry, can you tell us, Berkeley in many ways is similar to Cambridge, is similar to Santa Monica, but maybe from the tough word character, from a building character perspective, it's a little bit different from Cambridge. Do you have any, can you share anything with us in terms of how the, technical planning development standards are kind of shaping up, 45 feet in a single family neighborhood in Cambridge? Is that something you're considering in Berkeley, or is the scale a little bit different?
I think for our residential or smaller R zones, we're at 40 feet. But we're up to like 8 stories on the corridors in our bigger R zones. We're try as we might to pretend we're a small suburb. We're like nestled within like numerous like urban cities. We're right next to Oakland or right next to Emeryville. We have a really heterogeneous mix of building size and scale amongst our neighbors. But we're already seeing like 7-8 stories on our major corridors, like San Pablo, where I am, Shattuck, and we're building on our BART stations, 2 of our BART stations. So we were experiencing a kind of natural urbanization, further urbanization and intensification already. But people are really into their Victorians. People are really into their craftsman homes. And so the big battle for us is really expanding what we can consider as livable architecture. Because there are so many styles, and we have Julia Morgan buildings and things like that, and we have some really good in-home architects who are aware of our particular cultural appetite and who are capable of being in conversation with the buildings around their new projects and things like that. And that's something we can lean into as we cultivate our objective design standards. I was on a call today that was 4 of council and 4 of our rent board. And one of the things that one of my colleagues mentioned was the possibility of having district by district objective standards, so that each part of town could articulate its unique character, and that can serve as a way to sort of have our conversation around aesthetics and belonging without neighbors killing projects because they don't like cornices or whatever.
I am gonna I'm gonna ask, so Gleam Davis was not able to join us. Unfortunately, she had another obligation that is running long. So Carl's gonna jump on. And then we have the great pleasure of having West Hollywood Councilmember John Erickson join us. John, like Terry, was newly elected to City Council in West Hollywood in November, but affordable housing is one of his highest priorities. So John, I think I'll go to you. I'm curious about, your thoughts about the affordable housing overlay tool, whether you think this is something that West Hollywood should consider, what you see maybe as the pros and the cons for this tool in your small city.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to meet you all virtually. So great to be here with you all. I apologize, I'm on 2 other Zooms because this is a traditional Tuesday night after a council meeting. So we're doing all the important things that we do, but I mean, who isn't? And so it's great. And I have a really easy answer for you. The answer is yes. I've actually already instructed our staff to look at this for the city of West Hollywood, and how we are going to continue to look at anything in our arsenal to look at how we can encourage more housing, especially affordable housing. I know our city staff is working really and watching really closely what Santa Monica is doing, which is why it's great to have another champion like Gleam leading this way. And I know it was a fairly unanimous or a strong majority decision to have this go forward in Santa Monica, which is really encouraging, because right now we're seeing either constrictions with our zoning codes, or we're looking at the ways in which how can we encourage more development that is based on affordable and affordable housing for those that really want here. West Hollywood is one of the densest cities in Southern California, but California and the country in general. If you've ever been here, we're 36,000 individuals in 1.89 square miles. So we're along major commercial corridors, Santa Monica, Sunset, Melrose, parts of Beverly. I live right here on Fountain Avenue, so I get to deal with all of that, if you know the Los Angeles landscape fairly well. But when we look at the ways in which we either have to upzone, how we continue to look at our zoning code in general, or just finding ways in which, like with the affordable housing overlay zone, we can add more tools to our arsenal to promote affordable housing development. It's something I'm really interested in. I read too much about this stuff way too late at night when I should probably be sleeping. But that's the type of stuff with having advocates like all of you and individuals in our community fighting tooth and nail to make sure we're doing this. So I'm really excited to see how Santa Monica does it. And then I'm really excited to see how our city can bring this to our residents and have the council look at potentially doing this as well.
Thanks, John. John, can I ask you a quick follow-up question? I guess I'm curious about how you see this kind of fitting in with the housing element update. Is it something you try and get done before the housing element? Is it a recommended policy in the housing element? Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I know some of our Housing Elements Task Force members are watching this webinar right now. So hopefully, if they could suggest this, that would be great. We are still asking for public input. We have a Housing Elements Task Force that I just posted on my social media requesting input from our community, so that way they let us know. This is a really interesting time for the city. I was elected, as you said, in November, but it was the first time our city was ever on the presidential ballot. And so a lot more people in our community who maybe didn't know they lived in West Hollywood or never voted before in an election for city council voted. And I think we saw overwhelmingly things like affordable housing, looking at public safety and reimagining public safety. Traditionally, we contract with our sheriffs here. That's another webinar for another date. And then how we continue to look at, I think, what the city looks like. 50% of the city of West Hollywood is under the age of 40. And when you look at housing patterns and how younger people look at density and housing and transit and infrastructure, there's a more pro this dualistic language is there for a reason, but the more pro-YIMBY approach that we really see coming out of the woodwork. And for a really important thing, West Hollywood is home and near a lot of transit corridors, which is why SB 50 and all those other bills have always been quite controversial here, because essentially those bills would just do away with our zoning code completely. Some may like that, some may not. But the ways in which we have been working with the state to ensure that, how we have smart growth, how we continue to look at this in terms of our housing element is going to be really critical. This is something I'm really curious in. I think the Housing Elements Task Force will probably get there before this overlay zone, because how it works with local government is you have the city council consider it. We'll send it to staff, and then they'll probably take it to our planning commission, which is incredible. And then they would come back with recommendations, right? Because it goes through that public process, for better or worse. But that's how we are to ensure the public has a fair shake and participation, which is why organizing and efforts like this are so critical for us getting out the right verdict for what we do for our city. Because even though we're a part of this amazing West Side cities cog, we're right next to Beverly Hills, then LA, and then Santa Monica, but we're sandwiched in between Los Angeles as well. And so this is all stuff that we got to look for. And I know our Housing Elements Task Force has got some incredible members on it that are really pushing for these reforms.
And I think, you raise an important point about that it's a long process, right? We heard from David what a long process it was in Cambridge, but it is important to involve all of those voices and use it as an opportunity to kind of help folks who might not have as deep a knowledge about housing development, just what the challenges and barriers are to getting affordable units in particular produced. So it does create that nice opportunity.
Yeah.
Carl, I'm gonna toss you kind of a tough question, which is, this is you got off easy, John. In Santa Monica,
it's cutting out. I can't hear anything.
It's interesting to consider the overlay in Santa Monica, right? Because there already are different development standards for affordable housing development in Santa Monica. There's already a ministerial process for 100% affordable housing projects. So can you highlight for us, where you see the benefits? What's unique about an affordable housing overlay as opposed to what's already in place?
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit is I think one is the symbolic piece of ending a history of racist zoning policy that is carried onto the present, and that is, I think, one of the talking points that's been of most interest to many of the people we've spoken with about this. And the other piece is we need to be building a lot more housing, and affordable housing especially, and that should be something that all of Santa Monica should see as an opportunity. I hope, and I think many people do. I think more people are realizing that single family homes are out of reach for most working families in Santa Monica. And if we want to maintain a diversity of incomes and access to this city and the good jobs that it provides, we need to provide a range of different housing options. So yeah, I guess to kind of pass on the hot potato here, I'd be interested to hear from David, having been through this process and had a bit of a long process, knowing that we're on a bit more of a truncated schedule here in Santa Monica, trying to have this as part of our housing element discussion. We have a planning commission meeting. I think the next one on this is May 12th, and then June 2nd, I think it's going to be back at planning commission, and then finally at council later in June. What did you learn through that process that could benefit us? What do you know now that you wish you had known then? and if you had been on a rapid rocket ship approach to this, what's your advice?
I mean, to be fair, I'm an observer of this process. I wasn't in the middle of it. I think it's tricky to do. There's a couple. I'd be cautious. starting with the design of these has really got to be done carefully. And it's better to take another year, at some level, because I think you're only going to get one shot to get it right. If you get it wrong, my experience is in politics, your mistakes live with you forever, and people forget your successes tomorrow. So that's just, I would make sure that you think that the staff's there. And this is for a lot of communities, and I would think in Santa Monica, I think in Cambridge, it took a long time for people to get used to this idea, particularly giving up the development review piece of this, which is is sometimes the part that's ignored. I think people really had to wrestle with that, and kind of come along with it. So, to pick up Terry's metaphor, the Trojan War lasted a very, very long time. Terry, by the way, I was amused by your use of the Iliad. Doesn't the key actor die in that?
Technically, he dies a mortal death, but lives on everlasting.
Wow, mortal death.
Okay, so you won't be reelected, but you'll be famous for thousands of years.
Indeed.
There are worse fates.
I want to highlight for everybody that again, you can put questions. You should have access to the Q&A at the bottom. You can put questions in. And then if you click under answered, you'll see that David is quickly answering all of the questions, which is one of the reasons that I'm not asking them directly, because he's covering them. So there's 4 or 5 really intriguing questions and answers in there. I do want to pick up on this last question from John Given to kind of throw at the representatives from California. The Cambridge model, limited affordability to projects at 100% AMI. Really, the 80% for rental, mostly 80% AMI, and strictly applied to developments that are 100% affordable housing. And I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on whether your communities might consider variations on that. Carl, you want to start? Your community. Your thoughts. Santa Monica Forward's thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think Forward is excited to really share the opportunities that this provides, and from I think a political perspective, I think a lot of the city, many of the people that we speak with are open to this in a way that seemed impossible a few years ago, and hopeful that with the right messaging and organizing, we can really do something exciting here. That I think it sounds scary at first to people, but I think as everyone here is, I think eloquently said, it's not a big monster. I mean, this is really making neighborhoods accessible to regular people again. And I think that's what we want our community to be.
Okay, TBD is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
John, what are your thoughts on mixed income or higher affordability targets?
Well, I think at this point, if we're not looking at every option on the table, I think we're doing a disservice to our communities. I think that ultimately, the number one thing, the 2 top things I hear about most of the time are affordability, public safety, and then because it's West Hollywood, parking. But ultimately, the ways in which, our city, I think, is moving forward in a positive direction to get this. Carl mentioned organizing and the ways in which we have to build to, I think, get ourselves out of the rut that we've been in. Our arena numbers are quite high, but there's a reason for that. It's because cities have traditionally not built housing, and that's where we have to do our part. West Hollywood, cities like Santa Monica, other cities have always picked up a lot of slack for a lot of other cities that refuse to. They shall go nameless. But how we continue to do all of this. I mean, West Hollywood has one of the strongest rent stabilization ordinances in the state of California, if not the country. There's a reason for that. We are a city based and made up of renters. We're about 73% renters here in the city of West Hollywood. So when you think apartments, when you think rents, affordability, those are all top of mind for anything. That was the number one thing I talked to when I called voters in November and throughout, is that, you know, I can't afford to live here anymore. And then during a pandemic, I mean, they're all saying, how am I going to afford to live here or pay all this back rent back? So I think that if we're not looking at, I think the next step of what housing should be looking at, then we're not taking every tool in our tool belts and trying to fix a problem, right? And as I think we've seen with cities in California, sometimes it's the local governments that get it right first and then the bigger ones follow. I think that ultimately here, you know, it's not a one size fit all policy that sometimes works. We always have to tailor it and tool it. And that's why if it comes from the Housing Elements Task Force up, or the ways in which, who could have imagined Santa Monica voting to get rid of single family zoning 5 years ago when they did, you know, and the ways in which they just had that conversation with their Housing Elements Task Force and really dealt with redlining and those things. I mean, the fact that we're moving forward in this way, and I think cities locally are grappling with these issues themselves, just only shows that the future hopefully is bright, that hopefully there are people there that are willing to do it. And speaking from just an economical, you know, economic standpoint, you know, people want to build in these communities, people want to invest in these communities. And so how we continue to invest and incentivize affordable housing and housing in general is good for communities to make sure that they have all the amenities and people can live, work, and play exactly where they want to. And that's exactly what I think we should be pushing for in terms of our policy making.
Okay, thank you. Terry, what about you? Mixed income, higher targeting?
Thanks. We're considering allowing for 20% of the overlay to include households earning up to 120% AMI. Because of the state density bonus, we want to make sure we're not you know, creating a conflict between a local overlay and a state density bonus. We just, council just approved funding for Berkeley Unified School District personnel housing that included up to 120% AMI. And we have a big deficit in our moderate income area numbers as well. And we've struggled to provide housing for firefighters, nurses, and teachers. So we make sure that the overlay can include folks from extremely low income to moderate income.
That's super helpful. Thank you. It's great to hear some of the specifics on where you're headed. John?
I just want to say one more thing, and I'm so sorry because I don't want to take up space where I don't need to take space. As a young individual in West Hollywood, mixed income or that missing middle housing is so critical. I'm not saying we don't need to build affordable housing. Give me it all. Whatever I can get, give it to me, right? I'm here to take it. And I'm currently arguing with several developments in West Hollywood that have a lot of land that could be building a lot more affordable housing, but they don't want to. They want office space. Office space in a pandemic. What the? I won't swear in this recording because I respect you all. But I mean, Lord have mercy. We don't need office space in those areas, and no one's going back to an office anytime soon. But there are people of my generation. I will admit, as a proud gay man, I'm 35. That, you know, practically 5 years past death. If you look at what we do, but people like myself who, you know, are in that middle bracket income that cannot find housing where we live. That's a shame. We should not be building housing and then forcing people to drive hours a day, polluting our climate, continuing to not be able to live in the communities that they want to be a part of. Give me all the affordable housing, but also give me mixed income housing so that way people that want to live here, teachers, firefighters, directors, nonprofit workers, they can live here in the community and be a part of it. That's what I think West Hollywood should be shooting for. And that's one of my policy goals.
Amy, can I make 2 quick observations?
Yeah, and then we're going to wrap.
Yep. I mean, one is, you know, in places with hot housing markets, the beauty of, you know, don't forget the power of inclusionary zoning, right? That you can leverage those private developers, you know, to provide at least some more affordable units and more housing overall. The other is, interestingly, a better Cambridge, which really led the charge on this, actually their new campaign is the Missing Middle campaign. And so folks who are interested in that might want to take a look at what they're doing, and maybe have them in another year.
Great, thank you. Great way to end. Want to just profoundly thank everyone for joining us tonight. Really appreciate the electeds, John and Terry, joining us, and David. The presentation was great. It's really helpful to better understand again both the technical aspects and the process for how the overlay got adopted in Cambridge. So I think I'm going to toss it to Carl or to Chelsea. Oh, to Chelsea.
Really
And
quick.
I think and maybe the rest of us can just say goodbye and stop our video. So thanks everybody for the presentations and robust discussion.
Thanks everyone. And for the last few minutes, I just wanted to unveil a really exciting campaign that we're launching here at Santa Monica Forward. This is the first sneak preview that anyone's getting, so I thought we would just take the moment to do so. On your screen, you're going to see a really awesome sign that is available for you to get for your window or lawn or wherever you may place this. We're going to make these available, and you'll see an email in your inbox in the next 24 hours, getting you a link to be able to sign up. We know folks on this call are interested in being a part of this effort to continue to be a force for more housing in progress in Santa Monica, and we hope that this campaign will be a part of that. So I think that's all I need to share, and then Carl, you can go ahead and wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, and thanks to you and to Bill Parent on our steering committee who helped organize this event tonight. A huge thank you to my co-chair Abby Arnold, all the steering committee members of Santa Monica Forward, and to David, Terry, and John for joining us here tonight. This was super informative. I think we're really excited to be involved in this conversation and to help bring forward innovative solutions like this to big problems like affordable housing here in Santa Monica. If you're not on Santa Monica Forward's email list yet, please go to santamonicaforward.org and sign up. We'll be having more events like this in the coming months, and excited to involve you all in the conversation. With that, have a great night. Thanks for joining us, everybody.